Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Roberts as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to GovCon Unscripted. I'm your host, Chelsea Roberts, CEO of Collaborative Compositions. And today I've got with us Nic Adams, Director of Government Relations at Overland AI. Nic, who are you and what do you do?
Thanks, Chelsea. Appreciate you being here. And you just did the greatest job of introducing me right there. That is who I am, and that's what I do. Yeah, so as you pointed out, I do government relations for Overland AI. And what that really means is talking to Congress, congressional staff, keeping track of all of the different things happening here in DC for the company. And I've been with the company since November, and it's been a total blast being able to work in the defense tech ecosystem and then representing some of those interests here in DC among think tanks on the Hill with various members of Congress and their staff. And then I also work quite a bit still with a few defense tech companies in this ecosystem to help people understand how Congress works, how the budget cycles work, and of course, what that means in the context of getting a contract, which within the context of your show, I think that's probably something viewers are interested in. Yeah, happy to talk about that.
Yeah, I think probably a lot of our viewers in our audience have heard many a time, call your representative and make them do work for you as a member of their congressional community that they are representing on the Hill. But I think a lot of folks don't really think about how much influence or what influence Congress has or the Hill has, policymaking has, and in the budget cycle that we see. I am personally pretty familiar with the POM, and we'll have you explain what that is and then give folks a sense as to how you got into this and how you started having some of these discussions that have made you so familiar.
Yeah, no, you've laid out some really important things right there already. And I'll seize on something you just said, the amount of influence that the Hill and Congress has, not just on national policy, whether it's national security or defense or agriculture or healthcare, whatever it is.
Right.
All of those things are ultimately driven by what happens in debates here on Capitol Hill with the budgets that are pushed by the administration, and then how those budgets then are ultimately passed in appropriations bills every year, or in some cases, the reconciliation bill. And so I think a lot of Americans took social studies or civics in high school. They expect a process to happen a certain way. And the reality is that here on the Hill and in DC, there are certain bills that are very important, especially in the defense community or the national security community, if you're a startup founder or working for a company looking to get into government contracting. Now, there's things on the Hill that truly matter. And I think the things that matter the most are the National Defense Authorization Act, which passed nearly every year. Actually, it has passed every year for the last 63 years. And then there's the Defense Appropriations Bill. It's the money that then actually goes to Department of Defense and the services to then allow them to carry out their mission. To your point about the influence, the Hill is a very important place to engage early and often, especially as companies start to think about potentially influencing how those bills shake out.
And that's a hard thing for people to understand what engagement means. And does it come down to me picking up the phone and calling my local office or trying to get a hold of a congressional representative or sitting on a town hall, or is it further than that? Is there more involved?
Yeah, I think all of those things are important. The more you're engaging, the more your voice is going to be heard. One of the most effective tools for policy engagement is what's called fly-in season. It happens here on the Hill every spring, late winter, early spring. And it's when you have a lot of groups flying into DC from all over the country to have a conversation with their member of Congress or several members of Congress on a certain area that they really care about. And in many cases, they'll also engage with congressional staff. And I think this is one area where I tell people, especially founders in the defense tech space or other kind of early stage companies, just because you didn't get a meeting with a member of Congress, like the senator or congressman or congresswoman, doesn't mean that your idea is not important. It doesn't mean that what you're building is not important. It's the staff that ultimately write the bills. And if you're talking with the right staffer, that person likely has the ear of their boss. And so it's important to get that message to the individual. And this might be a good time to talk a bit about how it came to this to begin with. So my background was Army. I did that for about 10 and a half years on active duty. And then it was about that time where I decided I wanted to do something a bit different. So I came to DC. I went to Hopkins for a year and tried to figure out what I was going to do with 10 years of military service and kind of one foot into this policy space. And just had the opportunity at that point to work for a member of the House of Representatives who was on the Armed Services Committee. And so that was like my first kind of really foray into policy and legislation, and really hadn't, again, aside from that basic education that we all get, not a whole lot of understanding of the ins and outs of Capitol Hill, or really the importance of the things that are happening there, especially to people that are trying to get into this space. So I worked on the House side for a year. I was then given the opportunity to work in the Senate. So I worked for 2 different senators, 2 different points of time, and then spent 4 years on the Senate Committee for Intelligence as a committee staffer. And so I got 7 years to really dive in, understand how this place works. I had pleasure and opportunity to work on several pieces of legislation that ultimately were signed into law. Ships for America in 2020 is a pretty notable bill that we got to work on. And so all of those things really got me to understand it's not just about the debates on TV or the sound bites people might hear on the news. Real legislation is written on the Hill that impacts Americans everywhere. And there's a lot more work that gets done behind the scenes that I think the news cycle leads us to believe sometimes. And so with encouragement and that knowledge, I decided about a year ago to come into the private sector. And I'd always wanted to work with defense tech and national security tech companies, because I think that we're at a point right now in our country's evolution where we still need some of the big primes to produce some of the large weapon systems that I think we rely on to power across the globe. But there are new innovative technologies that I think are very important that need to get into the hands of the warfighters more quickly. And that led me to what I'm doing now. And it's a fun space to be in. And I really, probably given everything happening around the world, never more important time to get the right technologies into people's hands as fast as possible.
Yeah, and it seems like you're perfectly positioned to have that understanding of how to go about getting things into the hands as fast as possible. That just positions you in the perfect place to be able to do some of that, I guess, liaising between companies and Congress members and congressional staff to help them communicate their message effectively.
Yeah, I would say since having joined Overland AI, it's been a real fun opportunity to talk about a product that is needed and that works. And so I think one of the most encouraging things for me was when I joined the company, I actually spent the first week watching it perform in the field. It's an autonomous ground system. It's making its own decisions essentially on where it wants to go to navigate off-road battle space. And again, as having served in the Army previously, I was like, man, this would have been great to have back in the day to either carry things around the battlefield, to outfit with various different payloads and capabilities. Counter UAS, so unmanned aerial systems, is one such capability that I think, given the environment that we're in, where you've got cheap drones being proliferated kind of globally, having an autonomous ground system that you can put a counter UAS system onto right now would be a huge asset, really anywhere. And it's like coming to the company and seeing, wow, the system works really great. The autonomy works very well off-road. It can distinguish between whether it's a boulder or a bush, or it knows whether to go around something or whether it's able to go through something. And having a product that is effective, and then also seeing the strong demand signal that we're seeing with soldiers and Marines that have been using the product, makes it much easier than for me to go to Capitol Hill to have conversations with staff and senators and congressmen, because I'm not selling something that doesn't work. I'm selling, I think, a requirement that is being asked for by our men and women in uniform. And so that's, again, people that have served in the past, and they're always looking for, how do I keep serving? How do I continue to serve our country, even if it's not in uniform or even if it's not in government and policy? And what I love about this company, this opportunity, is that I get to do that, but now I get to wear a vest here.
Nice.
So uniforms.
Yeah. Much more comfortable uniform, right? Yeah. That's great. For folks that are curious about like how they can potentially engage with representatives, and whether it's the folks that are focused on a specific like topic area or tool area, I know there's a variety of committees that kind of gather and all have like different purposes. What should they have in mind when at least trying to go start some of these conversations? What's your ask that you go there with? Because they are going to inevitably be thinking, okay, I'm going to go there and I'm going to do like a capabilities briefing, like that I would do with a contracting officer. And it's just going to go like fantastically smooth. They're going to write all of this legislation, and then I will never have to talk to anybody in representatives again. My life will be perfect. So dispel some of those myths.
Yeah, I love the way you laid that out, because that's exactly right. I think a lot of people, they have a really good understanding of how contracting works because a lot come from that space. A lot of people understand what a contracting officer looks for, how to address requirements, what the requirements process looks like, and how to compete and win. I think that what some people do when they think about the Hill, one, they think, I don't know that it's the right time to engage there because we're really working on this business development thing right now, and that's where I'm putting all of my effort. I would tell people is it's never too early to go have a conversation with folks on the Hill, even if it's not your main effort. I always think of government relations, I'm not using a military term here, but it's like shaping fires to your main effort, which might be business development, right? If your intent is to land a contract with the Army, for example, then yeah, you absolutely need to be engaging with the Army directly. You need to be engaging with folks in the acquisition system, find a program manager that is working with you. And you have to have someone that is going to ultimately want to purchase your product. And I think it was General Denemy about a year ago in Army Futures Command before it was rebranded, but he was at a conference, and I just remember one thing he said that was just stuck with me. He said, you could be making the coolest thing ever, but if a soldier is not going to use it, then we're not going to buy it.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that everybody ought to just remember is that, yes, your idea might be amazing, but it has to be usable to the soldier or the Marine or whomever in the field. So that's one thing, right? And then in parallel to your business development efforts, that's where your government relations efforts can be so important. So that's when your first conversation with people on the Hill might just be a capabilities brief. It might just be getting familiar with the staffer that covers that portfolio on Senate services, or finding a member of Congress that's very active in that space. And there's a whole slew of great consultants and lobbyist firms here in DC that can help guide people to the right numbers. But there are also some things that people can do just by saying, let's say I develop a software platform that does X. Let me contact, or let me just find who in Congress has been very active in this space. What have public statements been in this specific space? And then you can start to figure out what members of Congress might be really interested in your idea. And it's also good to start looking at different caucuses and committees. Who makes up these committees and caucuses? One such caucus being the House and the Senate Defense Modernization Caucus. Those are groups of senators and congressmen that are passionate about modernizing our defense. And so that's a great place to start if that's the sector that you're in. And then the other thing I would tell people is always start with your home district and home state senator, because as much as people want to support innovative tech and want to help modernize our nations, they do care about their constituency. They do care about jobs in their district. They care about being reelected. And that's a rational thing to care about. If you are based in Austin, Texas, find who your representative is, get in touch with their state representatives, get in touch with their district representatives, and get in touch with their staff in DC, and just ask for that kind of first engagement and start having that conversation to build the relationship, so that when it's time for you to come back and ask for an appropriations ad or an authorizations ad in the NDAA, it's not your first conversation with that staffer.
Yeah, that sounds like such a logical plan, and I'm sure it follows through very neatly every time. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, there's plenty of times when you may want to have those conversations sooner, and people routinely ask me to, what should my ask be? And it's different for everyone, right? It really depends on where are you in your founder journey? Where is your company development? If you're a super early stage company, you may not be in a position where you're asking for a large appropriation ad quite yet, because you haven't done the legwork, the business development side with a service to go spend that money. And you may not have a viable product yet. You may still be in prototyping. So you may still have some work to do. In that case, it might just be a meet and greet with the staffer. Here's the company we're building in your district. It's a really cool thing, and here's what it's going to do. But then as you grow and develop the company, that's when you want to start thinking about, okay, what are my goals? Am I purely a government play? Is there a non-government, non-defense play here as well? And then if your entire revenue or business plan depends upon contracts, and yes, like at some point, you're going to want to make sure you're engaging those staffers, a plan to get some of that funded. And so that's typically the step after you've had those first conversations. Once your company reaches the point where, yes, a congressional appropriation is going to go a long way and give me what I need, helping me land those contracts. And then going back to my investors and saying, yes, there's buy-in here from Congress. It's not just the Army saying, we want this capability. There's real money being appropriated here by members of Congress that in some cases give people the ammo they need for that next fundraising round.
I mean, that's probably where a lot of the audience right now is trying to either head, or they have made that decision distinctly not to head in that direction and to find other sources of revenue. So I think that having a clear understanding of kind of what you can expect and how you can expect to approach it and how you need to spin the story or describe your organization and what you're doing and what you're producing in distinctly different ways than you would probably have to, like with an end user or with a requirements holder at an agency in particular. And you're in a particularly interesting and really accelerating, changing, and growing market, which is AI. So I'm curious, and this is just my naivete showing right now, is I have a feeling, and I'm probably wrong on this, hopefully I'm wrong on this, that Hill staffers are probably a little bit younger. They might even be like AI natives, like they understand it, they get it, they can pick it up. But when you get to that higher level and you get to directly to some of those congressional folks, they might be a little older. They might not be quite as in sync with what the new technology is, how fast things are changing, and all the things are developing. So do you have to have it such that it can be communicated effectively by that staffer to the congressional, like to whoever is their person, like their supervisor, CEO, boss, whatever you call them in their world, so that they can effectively communicate your story in a way that would make sense for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say a couple things. First of all, Hill staff typically consume information differently than maybe a DoD principal, right? I
Sure.
think anybody that's spent time in DoD comes with their PowerPoint deck
Yes.
or their placemat.
Quad chart.
Your quad chart, right?
Yes.
And for some reason, DoD always succeeds in making everything last an hour. So need to. And so there's never anything that takes less time than that. The Hill is different. The Hill, you get 30 minutes max. And staffers typically do their meetings in 30-minute blocks. And sometimes they're going to cut short and sometimes they're going to start late, depending on how many meetings they've got that day. If you're meeting with a staffer, then you're likely meeting with the person that covers that portfolio. And so they probably have an idea of what it is you're making. But again, to your point, if it's something novel or it's not been done much, then yeah, you're going to need to be able to explain what it is and ultimately why it matters. And always tie it back to that member's interests, whether it's the district or the state or the committee position they have or the caucuses they're on or the public statements they've made that show that they, again, like care about what it is you're making. I think tying it back to that is helpful. And then I've always told people, try to do as much of the work for the staffer as you can, because he or she is probably taking 5 or 6 of those meetings that day in between staffing the principal for hearings and committee meetings and answering emails, doing all the other things that a staffer does from 9 to 6. And especially if you're going in with an ask. So in that case, having a one-pager that you can leave behind with your ask, whether it's appropriations or authorizations, and then providing that staffer with a clear, concise overview, more often than not feels like a real conversation than a brief, right? Because you're looking that person in the eye, you're having a conversation, they're typically asking you questions, you're flipping through a deck. So yeah, in some cases, people do bring decks, and it's not the worst thing in the world, but we'll say that the less you leave behind, the better. And a one-pager typically ends up being useful to that staffer, whereas a lot of like stacks of paper ultimately end up in the trash. The other thing is if you're meeting with a member of Congress, now you're even more of maybe a higher level overview, unless it's something that they truly care about or really know about, because they are dealing with not just maybe a defense tech issue, they're dealing with healthcare, they might be dealing with immigration, they might be dealing with whatever foreign policy issue of the day. So there are so many things that consume a member's time that if you're getting a shot to brief a member, it has to be very clear and concise, and you may only get 15 minutes. And so those are just things that people have to keep in mind as they do those engagements. You're one of many people that are coming in to talk to folks that day, and it's best to make sure you're on message, on target, and you're delivering within the first 5 minutes your key salient points.
Interesting. And when you meet with somebody who is actual congressional member or principal, is that something that, are they going to be fluent in all of the acronyms that populate every branch of service? Are they going to at least know some of the basic things that I would expect just a fresh kind of brand new BD person to know in terms of acronyms? Do they speak the language?
It depends on who you talk to. And America is a very diverse country, and the Hill is a very diverse place. It's one of the things I loved about working there is that you do meet people from all over the country. You do see how different interests, different backgrounds, but they're representative there. And I think that's what makes it such an interesting place to work and such a fascinating place to engage. And so one of those things is knowing your audience, right? The person that represents your district may have never served in government before. They might come from business. They might come from healthcare. They might come from who knows where, right? They might have just had a completely different background before they decided to run for Congress. And they may not be as fluent with some of the acronyms. It's good to be able to spell those things out. And that doesn't make them necessarily ignorant or anything. They just have a different background than you. And it's just great to assume that they may not know everything, especially if you're an expert in your field. In most cases, their staff that are working that portfolio are going to be familiar with things. But again, it's always good to just have, rather than going in and throwing a bunch of jargon around, it's always good to just concisely and clearly lay out what it is you're talking about. I think that's probably good practice anywhere you go, certainly on the Hill where, to your point, you've got people in the House of Representatives that their election is every 2 years. So there's a lot more turnover. In the Senate, it's every 6 years. And they typically stick around for a bit longer. And then you said something earlier too, that in terms of like ages of staffers, I think in the House, that's true. Like the average age is probably under 30. Don't quote me on that. But if you look at the House of Representatives, like staff, typically younger, Senate staff, skewed a little bit older. And just understanding that, it's like any other meeting you take, knowing your audience, okay, this person, here's their background and here's what they've experienced. That may change the way that you tailor your message. But again, it's like anything, you ought to just be prepared when you go in and use your 30 minutes that you've got very effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. For those folks that are not native to the Beltway, is this an effort that they have to like establish an office? They have to set up continuous like 24/7 presence in DC, like right outside the doors, just to make sure that they are covering down their bases? Or is this something that they can plan out and add into their existing kind of BD schedule from that regard and take that into consideration as well?
I think that's probably true, especially in today's interconnected world, right? It's much easier to be able to say, okay, I'm going to be in DC for this week to engage with the Marine Corps on this project. I'm going to use part of that week to engage with some people on the Hill. I think that makes it much easier now than in the past. So I don't think companies need a permanent presence here, especially as they're getting started. There's also tons of consultancies and lobbyists here in town that in some cases can act as a fractional government affairs shop for growing companies. Earlier stage companies and even later stage companies will do is rather than hire a full-time person, they might go to a consultancy first and say, hey, can you all help us out with this? This is what you can do. And the consultants in DC range from singletons that are one person running a couple of different clients using their contacts, relationships, and knowledge of how the process works, all the way to well-established firms here in DC. But price points are, of course, going to change depending on what you're working with. So for an earlier stage company, they might look at one person running a couple of different clients as like their guy or gal because it's what they need right now. And in many cases, all they can afford, or certainly it ends up being all they need in most cases. And then as they mature their product, they mature their company, they either bring some folks in-house or they end up going to a shop. So I think the options here are numerous. I don't think anybody should think that they have to do this alone. I think that there are plenty of people that can help know the city and know the process intricately. So if founders are daunted by that, there are opportunities to make it easier. But yes, I think you don't have to do those things separately. I think doing BD and government relations in parallel, both when you're physically present in the city, but also as mutually supporting efforts. I think that's probably the best way to achieve your desired end state.
Okay. And you used a term that I love. I have always just had an interesting perspective on the term lobbyist, but is that what you consider yourself? Are you a lobbyist? And then is there a difference between what you view lobbyists as and what like other folks that are just in kind of general government relations might be?
It's a good question. So there are companies in DC that employ lobbyists specifically. And those people are registered lobbyists. They go out and they work with companies. They engage directly on behalf of that company to the Hill. And the key distinction between a lobbyist and a consultant. And there are legal definitions that I encourage everyone to look at.
Sure.
Again, it's, are you influencing policy? Are you asking for a specific appropriation or an authorization? And are you going up there and making that ask on behalf of that company? There's a lot of consultants that don't do that, right? They might set the meeting, they might make an introduction, they might help a company with their strategy, and then they may not be the ones that make the contact with the public covered official. And that could be somebody on the Hill as a staffer or a member. There's a certain rank requirement at DoD where that applies. And so there are very clear definitions of what a lobbyist does and what a consultant does.
Okay.
I think the key takeaway for founders is that ultimately what people need to figure out is, what is my goal? What is my end state? Do I need a lobbyist to go directly influence policy? Or do I need a consultant to help me shape my broader DC engagement strategy?
Okay.
And so I think there are nuances there. I'll also take this opportunity really quickly to go back to something we talked about earlier, which is the appropriations process. So a lot of people also think that if they successfully get an appropriation added to the appropriations bill, that they're good.
Sure.
Like their lobbyist went to the Hill, they handed in a thing, the staffer says, hey, yeah, we got your ask added. We're going to plus up this account by X amount. In many cases, founders are like, great, that 5 million or that 10 million or whatever it is coming to me. But that's not how appropriations work. That money is going into an account that a program manager is going to run over at the department or at one of the services. And this is where I go back to the BD being a parallel effort to government relations. Because if you haven't started working that business development angle yet, you haven't had those conversations, that account will get plussed up and that money will get spent, but it might get spent on what you want. So it's just really important that, again, those conversations happen simultaneously, and that, again, like program managers are not going to influence what goes in the bill. That's not their job. That's all coming from the president's budget, which is very carefully coordinated before it reaches Congress. Again, as a BD or a GR professional, it's definitely your job to make sure that somebody wants to actually buy what you're selling before you get the Hill to throw money at it.
Subtle nuance there. Subtle nuance.
Very important.
Yes, actually having somebody that at the end of the day will say, yes, that is my money and I want to do this with that. And it has to be in your line of thinking and line of effort when you're looking to do relationship in government, just all around. I'm curious what you saw on the Hill in your time, like working on the Hill, and that you wanted to change when you came into industry.
Great question. I think for me, it was looking at ways to just make it easier to buy things, make it easier for acquisitions professionals to be able to buy the things that are needed. And again, I've never been a contracting officer. I've never worked in acquisitions. I'm always careful here because there are people that do this for their career and they are very good at what they do. But one of the things that we noticed from the congressional standpoint is that sometimes more authorities were needed in order to procure things either more quickly or just to procure the things that we needed. In some cases, authorities did exist, and we needed to help make it clear that those authorities should be exercised. Right? In some cases, it wasn't even that we didn't have the authority. It's that some people either didn't know, or the incentive structure was still such that it didn't make sense for them to do that because what has been working for so long works well from their perspective. And they may not want to be the one that takes a risk, buys something that doesn't work, and then ends up potentially losing their job. And so our approach was always like, we understand that. And we know that there is that concern, I think, that people have that work in those spaces. And so how do you alleviate that? How do you change the incentive structure? How do you make it less risky, maybe, for somebody in what's often referred to the frozen middle to make a decision that will elevate a certain technology or a certain product in a way that is beneficial to ultimately the warfighter, but also to the industry that's been built up around supporting the warfighter. And what's really encouraging right now in the defense tech space is the amount of energy and really funding that's been going into the space, right? There is real excitement around building next generation tech for the warfighter, and there are a lot of people working on it. And again, when I was on the Hill before I came to this industry, I was just sitting by it and was like, how do we just, again, ultimately get the warfighter what he or she needs to be successful? And then from away here on the outside, trying to do the same thing. So ultimately it's changing things, but maybe improving and modifying the process could be another way to think about it, because again, some things work very well, but there are some things that I think are frustrating, not just to industry, but I think to people in the field that say, we've been using this product for months and we just buy it. And I think that's where you hear a lot of people saying the right things at the top, and you're hearing a lot of demand signal at the bottom. Sometimes it's just hard to reconcile those things and get it through the entire process.
And that's the frozen middle. What are you referring to when you say frozen middle?
Yeah, you hear that term a lot, and I think it means different things to different people. But my best understanding is at the top, you've got appointed officials, you've got senior officers and civilians saying, we need capability X. And then you've got end users saying, this capability works great, it meets our requirement. And one thing people refer to, again, the frozen middle, it's machinery in between that. And a lot of it is just bureaucratic inertia, right? It's hard to change an organization that has done things a certain way for a very long time. And so it's a matter of changing incentives, structures, maybe even culture in some ways, right? There's a lot of different ways to get at this. But I think that the encouraging thing is people understand that, yes, there are things that need to change in order to become a little more agile and a little bit more nimble across the federal government. And I think it's encouraging, and we've seen some encouraging signs now, whether it's different legislation or vehicles that have been put in through legislation for contracting. And then also some of the things that we're hearing from the department now where we need to move fast on this because this is a requirement that's needed in the field and we need to get it out to the warfighter. And so that's, again, like from my perspective, there are people thinking about it and we are seeing some meaningful things being implemented at this point.
Now, if folks want to get a hold of you and they need help working their way through that frozen middle, through the bureaucratic maze that the Hill can be at times, how can they get a hold of you and how should they reach out to you?
Yeah, great. So definitely happy to share my LinkedIn page. I check that pretty frequently. That's where a lot of this community resides. So happy to add that in the show notes, but also it was a number of different kind of hubs that are sprouting around across the country. Station DC is one such hub here in DC, which combines policymakers and investors, founders, people that are working in the administration, people that are working on the Hill. And it's become a gathering place of sorts for a lot of people that are interested in learning more about this. So that's a cool physical space where people have started to have various different events. But yeah, I think just reaching out over LinkedIn, always happy to have a conversation with folks that are interested in how this works because it is complicated, but it's not impossible. And things change daily, but there is a certain pulse and heartbeat to the city. It's just tapping into that and figuring out how to make it work for you, I think is the challenging part. Again, happy to chat.
If you need somebody to help you tap in and learn how to love the Hill, then it sounds like you're the guy.
And if it's not me, I know a lot of folks that can also help. But yes, I'm happy to have that initial conversation. And again, there's a lot of professionals here in DC. A lot of came from the Hill, came from the department, came from the military, or came from the investor community or other places that are passionate about solving some of the same problems or even working on some of the same issues. And so I'm always happy to help people where I can and get them in touch with somebody if I can.
I love that. That's fantastic. That's an offer that we're definitely going to get covered in the show notes and make sure that everybody knows that they can reach out to you to help them navigate or at least get pointed in the right direction for some of that navigational assistance. Because I know firsthand the Hill is not necessarily the most straightforward or easy place to wander around and to work. So I appreciate you sharing some of your insights and being on the show today. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, like I said, happy to chat anytime. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
All right. See ya.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Roberts. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.